Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governance for Schools webinar. The focus of our webinar this morning is a culture of no surprises, intelligent governance monitoring. And I'm delighted that my somewhat enigmatic title hasn't put many of you off attending this morning. We've got very large numbers actually registered to attend. So if I could please, encourage you to make comments, ask questions as we're going through. It's always good to make these sessions as interactive as we possibly can. But also, please, if you are wanting to make questions, if I could ask you to, sorry, did I say make questions? Ask questions or make comments, I should have said. Could I ask you to please use the Q&A panel rather than the chat? It's quite difficult to actually monitor the chat because it dips in and out when you're in presenter mode. If you haven't got the Q&A panel opened yet, you'll find it. So the toolbar should be either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on what sort of device you're accessing the session from this morning. Scroll right the way across to the right-hand side, and you'll find there is a little circle with three dots in it and says the word more underneath. Click on that, and on the drop-down menu you'll find Q&A. Just click on that and the Q&A panel will actually appear on your screen. Move it to wherever you like and it'll just sit there in silence for the duration. But put your questions or comments in there and they'll wing their way across to me, and I'll be delighted to try and respond to them for you. Luckily we have Emma from Governance for Schools is sitting in the background, so if there are any that I miss, she will hopefully point them in my direction. Okay, so no more ado, let's kick off the session. So, culture of no surprises, intelligent governance monitoring is our theme this morning. My name is Steve Barker. I'm the head of governance and training at Judicium Education, which is part of the supporting education group, and Better Governor is the brand that we use to communicate an awful lot of governors with. Session this morning is split into three elements, really. First of all, and probably most importantly, to explore what we mean by the term that I'm using, a culture of no surprises, and I'll say more about that in a few moments. I also want to think about how we link that to the way in which we hopefully reflect on how our monitoring in our individual schools and trusts um, firstly should actually operate in terms of the processes that we have set up, but also how we ensure that it's focused on what it should be and structured effectively to actually facilitate that. Because as governors, we need to have information in order to facilitate the decisions that we make. And so it's an important function for me to make sure that we are actually focusing on the right areas. And as we go through, what we'll hopefully try and do is actually explore what we mean by this term intelligent monitoring. I've also introduced the phrase here, key performance indicators or KPIs, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And having that focus does help us as governors and trustees ensure that we do have an accurate overview of our schools, but specifically an accurate overview of what really matters in terms of driving our schools and our trusts forward. I can see there are a few questions coming up on the panel with regard to slides. You will all get copies of slides sent to you after the event. Okay, so as I said, I want to start off with just exploring what we mean by a culture of no surprises. And it's a phrase that I've used for many years. I've been around for many years now, and I've been involved in governor training and trustee training for quite some time as well. And for me, it's about avoiding some of those surprises that actually can be quite earth-shattering for us as governors, as members of schools, school communities, and as trustees, perhaps sitting there getting surprises about some of the schools actually operating within our trusts. So, what do we mean by surprises in terms of the ones that we want to actually avoid? Because that's what this is really all about. And for me, they fall into a few different categories, and you may even have more of your own to add to this. But the first one, and please don't think I'm vilifying an individual school here. I'm not. This just happens to be a school that Ofsted made some judgments on in this last year, which are not particularly favourable for the most part, and I'm guessing probably came, in fact, I know came as a big surprise to those governors. So this is all information that's in the public domain. You just search on the Ofsted website and you can find information like this. But of course, if this was your school, this would be a surprise you actually wouldn't want. But actually, the point of my culture of no surprise is that we ensure as governors, we ensure as boards that we are getting the information that we need that puts us into that place where hopefully we know what we need to know, our view is accurate, our self-evaluative processes are accurate, so we know exactly what the outcomes of Ofsted inspections and other aspects of school life are going to be. Ofsted isn't the only one, of course. And no matter whether you're an apologist to governors in secondary schools, I've picked a primary example here, but hopefully you'll see that this can be mirrored with secondary outcomes for public examinations as well. Our outcomes in our schools shouldn't be a surprise to us either. Um, it's quite nice sometimes if it's a pleasant surprise and we come in, a few points higher than we thought we were going to. But actually, all of us as governors, the whole board, should have that understanding, that depth of knowledge that says this is where we think we're actually going to come out in terms of pupil outcomes this year. Obviously, this is just a slide that I actually took from borrowed from somebody else, an organisation called Third Place Learning here. This is just a way of demonstrating the outcome, and this is obviously looking at an analysis of maths that gives governors in this particular school, and importantly, of course, teachers, an indication of how children actually fared in that end of Key Stage 2 maths paper, or maths paper, sorry, I should say, looking at where they picked up their marks and where they didn't. And the importance of the no surprises, and particularly on this one, which is about data, of course, is that if we're being fed information about no surprises, if we're being fed information that actually fuels that culture of no surprises, then hopefully what it's doing is also fueling our ability to ask questions, but actually the school's ability to respond to those messages that are out there, rather than letting them go forward and become, perhaps the expected outcomes that we don't want. We certainly don't want surprises with regard to safeguarding as governing boards, and certainly our schools don't either, of course. And I've just put this here. This will be a quote that you're all very familiar with. Safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. And I would actually extend that to say that from a governance perspective, we don't want any surprises with regard to safeguarding in our school if we can possibly avoid it. And therefore, it's our responsibility as governors to ensure that part of that role for us is ensuring that we are armed with the information that we need to provide assurance that safeguarding is effective, is in place, and is actually protecting children and promoting their welfare. I can see there's a question on the panel from Tim. Tim saying, for what size of cohort does data become less reliable? Please, and ought we say this more openly? I think that's a good question, Tim. I mean, this isn't primarily about data this morning, but of course, data does play a big part in this backdrop that I'm outlining here. And I think if you're a governor in a small school, which perhaps I'm suspecting you are, then I think you have to be aware that there are some frailties, shall we say, because yes, if you're in a very small school, then actually the data that you have in terms of sample size may often mean that you don't actually get the depth of analysis that you might otherwise get. That said, there are plenty of sources out there. There's a great website called which I might mention again later. Part of the DFE's provision is called Compare School and College Performance, and that allows you to actually look at the performance of other schools and compare it with your own data, even if things like the Ofsted dashboard, which again we're going to talk about a little bit later, even if that doesn't give you that depth of analysis. So I think there are measures out there, and again, avoid the obvious, which is comparing this year with last year, because it's the apples versus oranges comparison isn't always a valuable one either. I hope that answers your question, Tim. And then the last surprise that I've actually put on here, just as indicative surprises that we don't want, is of course bad financial news. Now, I think most of us are actually very well versed in operating in an environment at the moment where money is not plentiful in our schools and in our trusts, but we have to make sure that as governors, Certainly, we understand the environment that we're operating in from a financial perspective, but also from the perspective that things are changing around us, and we want to make sure that we are forward planning, that we have that view to the future. Okay, so that just gives you an indication of what I mean by a culture of no surprises. So, of course, in order to avoid these surprises, what I want to do is make sure that I'm being fed information as a governor and as a chair in a couple of schools. I want to make sure that all of my fellow governors and trustees on the boards I sit on are also receiving that diet, which is actually not just feeding them information, but actually feeding them the right information, which avoids those surprises that we really don't want to be confronted with. So, in terms of how governance as a concept, governance as a real aspect of our schools is concerned, what do we do to avoid those surprises? Well, of course, my simplistic answer is, well, you create a culture where you don't get any. But what does that actually mean in reality? Well, for me, the components of that culture of no surprises are first and foremost thinking about, well, what is the information we actually need as a school, as a trust, that gives us those key pulse points now? Because we, as I said in the introduction, we know the term KPIs, those key performance indicators for our school, which assure us, and it is about assurance, assure us that we're actually getting the correct information, which again feeds into that no surprises culture. And I'm always reminded by, and again, this is a reflection of my age, there was a lady many, many years ago who used to be a column writer for the Times Education Supplement. Her name was Joan Sallis. She's no longer with us, but she once said something when I heard her speak that really resonated with me and has stuck with me ever since. And it relates to governors monitoring. And she said what we should all be aiming to do as governors in our schools is measure what we value, or we'll end up valuing what we measure. Now, that's not as trite as it might seem at first, because it's very easy for us to measure those things or to value those things that are actually thrust down our throat at every opportunity, not just by the DFE, sometimes by our schools, sometimes by our local authorities. But actually, what we should do as governors is take a step back and think about, well, what's the information that really defines the space that we're operating in as a setting? What's the information that we should have as governors that actually reassures us that we're doing the right things by our pupils? And of course, the way we do that is by identifying those key performance indicators. And I will say a little bit more about that in a few moments. And then ensuring that our monitoring as governors is actually focused on those key performance indicators. And I think the next bullet point, the third mini bullet point on this slide, is something that's crucial to that, ensuring that process actually occurs. What I mean by saying aligning monitoring with school development priorities, those should be focused on the key performance indicators anyway. But from a governance perspective, I conduct quite a number of external reviews of governance each year. And one of the things that very often baffles me, I think is a fair way to. And one of the things I'm often suggesting as a potential improvement for governing boards is that they are still focusing their monitoring on governors being linked to individual subjects within the school. Now, I'm not sure that fits with the strategic role of governance in the 21st century, let alone in the yeah, 25th year of that century going into the 26th. My belief now is what because our schools should absolutely be focused on school development or school improvement priorities, whichever you prefer to call them, so should our monitoring as governors. So I would prefer a system where we had monitoring links or link governors, if some of you call them that, actually paired up not with individual subjects, but actually with priorities in the school development or improvement plan. And again, I think that's a good way, providing we have effective communication between governors, from governors back to the school, etc. That's a good way of ensuring, again, that culture of no surprises. So where we've got those governor links and visit priorities for us as governors, focus those on the KPIs as well. So for me, there are four KPIs. Now, again, dependent on your school, and I was doing some training in a special school yesterday, and clearly some of their priorities are going to be a little bit different from that. But for all schools, irrespective of whether we're mainstream or special, whether we're secondary or primary or nursery, um, all of us should be focusing on these. And I think all of us, when we make lists, and my bullet points here are definitely a list, we actually prioritize those. And for me, pupil outcomes has always got to be the first thing as governors that we should look at about our schools. It's lovely that our children are happy in our schools and they're safe, etc. And that's something that we would actually like to take for granted. We can't always, but actually, that's not a cause to rest on laurels. What we should be saying is, of course, we want children to be happy. That's a vital ingredient in the overall outcome of the schools. But actually, pupils' academic outcomes are also, that's why our schools exist. So, pupil outcomes is always going to be number one on my list. And we're going to focus on each one of these in turn on the following slides. Inclusion, and I haven't put that there just because it's a new judgment within the new Ofsted framework that's just been introduced last month, although that's quite imperative as well, of course. I am a firm believer in inclusion. I always have been, and I would always want to know that my school is an inclusive school. It practices inclusive. Sorry, its practices are inclusive and so are its policies. And I think that's something that governors actually should be very mindful of. In order to do that, of course, we need to know our schools and we need to know that our schools are meeting the needs of all of our pupils. And we'll say more about that in a few moments. Safeguarding, of course, is hugely significant from a compliance perspective. That never goes away, but I have a background in safeguarding, and I always say to staff and to governors when I'm actually delivering training and development sessions that, yes, of course, this is grounded in compliance, as in safeguarding, but we don't do it as schools. We don't do it as governors. We don't ensure that our schools are safe places because the law tells us we should. Hopefully, we do it because we fervently believe it's the right thing to do, and we actually fervently believe that children and young people deserve to be safe in our schools. So there's a moral imperative there as well as a statutory one, of course. But what that does mean is it's hugely important that we should be monitoring it. So I can see there's a question on the panel from Razila. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Given the recent changes in Ofsted inspection framework with the KPIs you mentioned, is there a standard monitoring template we can adapt and build on? I think that's an interesting question. Thanks for that, Razila. My simple answer would be no, but what I'm going to share with you may give you a few pointers. I am a great believer, and I'm sorry, this isn't dodging your question, but I'm a great believer in we are, as governors, we all of us are to an extent led by the Ofsted framework, but we don't do what we do because of Ofsted. We do what we do because it's the right thing to do for our pupils day in, day out, term in, term out, etc. So hopefully what I'm going to give you will help you perhaps put that together. But any template that you want to create should actually be informed by your own context, by your own school, etc. So what I'm going to give you on the following slides against each of these key performance indicators is an indication of what I believe governors and trustees should actually be looking at, and maybe they're things that you might want to include in your template if you're creating one. Okay, and obviously no surprises, as I said before here, and pun unintended on that. I also think that in the current climate, finance has to be up there on our performance at the moment. Whatever the context of your school in terms of numbers on roll, it is something that we actually need to be mindful of because of the very, very significant impact that has on finance. We've also got some legacy finance issues that a lot of schools have taken forward. And of course, because of pressures on government spending at the moment, there is no easy solution to that. So it's an area that governors need to be very mindful of the risk of surprises on. And therefore, I think it's something that we don't sort of set to one side and think, well, okay, we're focusing on the curriculum, we're focusing on pupil outcomes here. We've got a team of people looking after finance. All of us as governors, all of us as trustees are expected now to actually have that overview of the school's finances, so we know what the state of the finances are right now, but also moving forward into year one, year two, year three of the our future forecast. Okay, so as I intimated, what I'm going to do is, and hopefully this will answer some of the elements of the question that Rosila just asked. My idea about intelligent monitoring is linked to this idea that we're actually measuring the things that we value in our schools. And some of that will be influenced by what we need to know, of course, and that doesn't actually change. So we're going to look at each of my four suggestions for what are the main key performance indicators. First one being pupil outcomes, as we said, and one of the ways in which we meet the my idea for intelligent monitoring criteria is to ensure that as governors, as trustees, we regularly receive the outcomes of assessment that is being undertaken in our schools. And what I'm actually saying there, of course, is that don't just monitor the data that's published. So we've got lots of data that's actually published on end of key stage SATs, end of year, key stage two, of course, I'm talking about. Key stage one's not published anymore, but we've got early years data that's published. We have our own internal data, and it's our internal data that actually fills in all of those gaps between those big, what I call punctuation points, where there is national data. So we've got national data for early years. We have it for phonics check, for tables check, for end of key stage two, and then obviously at the end of key stage four in terms of public examinations, etc. That's great, and of course we should look at that, but we should also look, if we want to actually live in my culture of no surprises, we should look at what assessment is telling us about what's coming along next year, the year after. And I did a session last night looking at the role of understanding secondary school performance data for governors. And one of the comments I made there is that there is a real temptation in secondary schools to only ever look at your top line data that's published and goes into league tables, etc. That's great, but it's not enough. What we should be doing is looking at, for example, and I'm using a secondary example here, of course, but the same model applies in primary. What did our assessment data look like on entry? Have we got prior attainment data for that year group? Obviously, for 2025, we didn't because of COVID, but lots of secondary schools, for example, will do their own assessment, baseline assessment on entry, etc. Midias is a good example of that. Is that data shared with us? Because actually what that does, what that data provides us with, as well as data at the end of year seven, end of year eight, etc., and so on in primary schools, what that says is this is where this group of children, this particular cohort is now, and it enables us as governors to ask questions about, well, you know, we don't want the inevitable necessarily to become reality. What can we do to change the outcomes there? So if we've got a group of children who perhaps are struggling and did struggle with reading and with writing at the end of Key Stage 2, what are we doing in the early parts of Key Stage 3 to actually improve the chances that they will perform better, and hopefully by the time we get to the end of Key Stage 1, we'll have the ability and the knowledge within reading and writing to perform better in all of their GCSE areas. I can see a question on the panel from Mel. Nice to see you here again, Mel. Thanks for the question. And Mel's asking, what role does the governance professional in supporting governance monitoring? How should governors and senior leaders be working with them to make sure monitoring is effective and incorporated in agendas and meetings? I think that's a great question, Mel, and I think you and I are always of one mind on this. I think the governance professional, the clerk, is absolutely vital in this. I was doing some training a couple of weeks ago on data and the role of the clerk stroke governance professional, and I think the governance professional should be working with the chair, or the chair of committees if data goes through a committee, as well as the head teacher. One of the things I always say to to clerks and governance professionals. And I did some head teacher training recently, and I mentioned it to them as well. And I have to say, it went down reasonably well. And that's all about the rule of three. What are the three things from a head teacher's perspective? And again, this is a question that I think the governance professionals should be asking. What are the three things that you want governors, you want trustees to take away from this data? Because very often there's and I don't mean to be rude in saying this, but there's very much a splattergun approach to data that head teachers want to share everything about the data with governors. Now, if we don't live and breathe data every day as governors, which probably most of us don't, it's important to say, well, okay, what do we want to take away from this? Because the important thing, and again, I'm sorry I'm coming back to Ofsted again, but Ofsted want to know that we all sing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak. They want to know that we all understand what the priorities of our school are. So I think that's crucial, and I would expect the governance professional stroke clerk to be instrumental in ensuring that happens. And maybe they're the one that goes to the head and says, well, what do you want to share? Because actually then I will ensure that those three main, and there's nothing magical about three, it's just that there's an established rule that says it's easier to remember three things than 17. It can be four, it can be five, it can be two, but what are those main key indicators you want governance to take away from the data? As I mentioned, we have actually got quite a few different sets of data that are actually available for to us as governors, not all of them directly. The Ofsted Inspection Data Summary Report, or the IDSR as it's actually often referred to, that should, in Ofsted's mind, be available to all governors. It's not unless you request it, but schools should give governors access to that, and that should be shared with you. And that's helpful. That's a good guide. Lots of information on school context in there, as well as past performance. It's a good summary document, which of course is what it's intended to be. It's used by Ofsted inspection teams when they come into our schools and trusts. Then we've got the ASP report, the Analyse School Performance. That's published directly from the DfE. Governors do not have access to that because it contains pupil level data. And so that is the one that we would expect schools to be sharing in presentations during governing board meetings, etc. But something that schools can, and I encourage schools to actually do this, I encourage governors to do this, there is a free to access website called Compare School and College Performance. You can go in there, you can search by school name, by postcode, local authority. You can even search, if you wish to, by political constituency or parliamentary constituency, sorry. I'm not sure, other than MPs who want bragging rights, why anybody would want to do that, but the option is there. But the importance of that is you can look at key performance indicators defined by the DfE, of course, for your school, and you compare it to, or you can compare it to the national picture, of course, and your local authority picture, but you can also choose individual other named schools to compare it to. So if you've got a school just down the road from you and you say, well, they're a good match to us, they're similar in terms of their context, historically have been similar to us in terms of pupil premium, SEND, etc., you can actually identify them and you can compare your performance on a whole variety of different levels. And of course, what that's doing is enabling us as governors to actually build our background knowledge before perhaps we're presented with more in-depth data about our own schools. I can see this question on the panel from Rosemary. Rosemary saying, I often worry about link governors as often they don't know what to do. What questions to ask, especially as they worry about being too operational? We link responsibility for monitoring KPIs to a committee and find that works well. What other models might there be? Um, I, I think you're right. I mean, your footnote is they're probably going to address this as well. I am going to come on to that and touch on it as we go through, but that sounds like a great idea to me, Rosemary. I do think that it's important whether you have have committees or sorry, a designated committee that looks at performance. One of the schools where I'm chair, we have what's called a standards and performance committee, and we do what it says on the tin kind of thing. We absolutely focus on that, but we also have if you like, a micro session on that at a full governing board level, because then it links into the roles that all of our individual governors get, and when governors come and visit, and that's linked not at all to subjects unless they're part of our improvement plan. Of course, that's actually linked to the priorities for the school at that moment in time and what we've already identified as our KPIs. Excuse me. And of course, I just want to come back to that first point again. This might seem like a little bit of a repeat of the first bullet point here. Reviewing assessment data regularly, but that must include the expectation that as governors, we know what's happening with all year groups, both attainment and progress-wise, but also the very last bullet point for those individual groups of pupils. And again, I'm going to talk about inclusion in just a few moments, but inclusion means that as governors, as trustees in our schools and trusts, we know what's happening in all of those different groups. Yes, we've been looking at special needs for a while. Yes, of course, because of pupil premium, we've looked at our disadvantaged pupils. But have we identified other relevant groups? Those with poor attendance, for example. That's something that we absolutely should be looking at now because that's a priority. And if attendance is an issue or it's an improvement aim in your school, that should be one of your KPIs as well, of course. I was at a meeting in one of my schools yesterday morning, and one of the things that our principal does, we're a secondary school, but it works in primaries as well, is to compare those pupils who are disadvantaged, those pupils who are SEND, and those with poor attendance. And our principal was a maths teacher, and she likes data, and she is brilliant at providing excellent data to the governing board. And she produced a really interesting Venn diagram yesterday morning with those three groups in it, and it shows to us that attendance is actually the key to performance and improved performance and progress of SEND pupils, but also disadvantaged pupils. And that feeds very much into that inclusion agenda. But again, those are all key performance indicators for us as a school. So moving on, and sorry, my screen froze for a moment. So if we do all of those things, and perhaps a few more beside as we were talking about, what will I end up knowing as a governor? Well, hopefully I end up with knowledge of attainment of all of the different pupil groups. I also know their progress, and again, that comes out of looking at year on year, looking at prior attainment, etc. I'm also aware of where we expect to be at the end of the year, potentially the end of the key stage in terms of pupil outcomes. And that's the most crucial one, of course, because that's a surprise I really don't want. If we are comparing and contrasting, we're getting an accurate view of where our school sits, perhaps with statistical neighbours, etc., which is also helpful. We also have a very good overview of subject strengths, particularly in secondary school where you get data on all the subjects. But of course, we get English, as in reading and writing, but also maths data. But in primary schools, do we ever ask for data on the foundation subjects? Do we ever ask for data on the things, again, that we don't always measure? Because perhaps we should. And I'm sorry, I've used an abbreviation on that next slide, literally just to get it all on one line, and so I didn't spill onto another slide. But intelligence regarding the school development plan and the next iteration of that is also crucial because, of course, what we should be doing, and this is primarily data. There's a lot of dialogue going on and narrative around the data, but what that does is actually inform us as governors as what we should expect in the next school development plan. And of course, if we've got that knowledge, we're armed with that, then the next iteration of the school development plan also should not be a surprise to us. And that, again, that feeds into that culture. And I also think it's important about knowing the right questions to ask. And we did a webinar a couple of years ago with Governors for Schools actually on asking the right questions. And it's something that I am keen to share with governors on an ongoing basis. Asking questions based on what we've been told, asking questions on what we should expect, and actually following up on those questions and digging a little bit deeper ourselves as governors. Ultimately, what that means, of course, I believe, is that if we're following all these steps, we are, as far as pupil performance is concerned, operating in that no surprises culture. That leads me on to the second one, which is inclusion. And again, if we're thinking about, well, what does intelligent monitoring inclusion actually look like, is an understanding of school context. And when I say school context, I mean the context of those little people, or sometimes somewhat larger people, coming through our school gates and into our classrooms every morning of the term. If we know our pupils and what their needs are, we can monitor how their needs are actually being met. And that doesn't just mean those youngsters with additional needs, special educational needs and disabilities. It means those disadvantaged pupils, those who are, perhaps got poor attendance at the moment, though, boys versus girls, all of those different groups of pupils that make up the context of our schools. And I haven't given you an exhaustive list there, of course I haven't, but you will know for your own schools, for your own trusts, what those significant groups are. But again, knowing who the groups are enables us to actually monitor how their needs are being met. And that's the crucial element, of course. Linked to that, as governors, we should be seeking assurance that the curriculum is actually adapted to meet their needs, and how that's being done. Now, very often, I would suggest that governors actually doing a learning walk based on inclusion at the moment is a very good idea. And one of the things to look out for is when you're in a classroom, how do you see work differentiated for different groups of pupils, different ability groups, etc., within the classroom? How are they being supported? One of the key planks of the curriculum and assessment review that was published last month, and the government has actually already published its response to that, is that there is going to be an expectation that schools shape their enrichment programs now to meet the needs of all pupils. And this is very much an inclusion agenda. Governors often overlook enrichment activities and extracurricular for that matter, in terms of not understanding how they enrich the curriculum, how they actually build on pupils' knowledge, development, etc., but also how are they shaped so that they meet the needs of all pupils in the school. And I think that's something crucial as well. The question from Ishmael on the panel. Thanks, Ishmael. Ishmael's asking, how can we consider the data value of increasing behavioral issues and their link to absence? Is this a local and country trend? Um, I'm not quite sure what you mean by data value there, Ishmael, but I think the link between behaviour and attendance is clearly a tangible one. If attendance is actually being impacted by the volume of suspensions and permanent exclusion, then clearly that's something as governors we need to be mindful of, and perhaps we need to be asking our schools to think about their management and behaviour policy and what we do, particularly where we've got youngsters with needs, because I think we're all aware that children with special educational needs and disabilities are overrepresented in permanent exclusions from schools. What are we doing to prevent exclusion? What strategies are we putting in place? And again, here, how is the curriculum adapted to meet the needs of pupils who struggle to sit down for 50 minutes because of their additional needs? Are we giving them breaks out of the classroom? Are we actually deploying teaching assistants where we've got them to actually work with groups of pupils, not necessarily with individuals, but to work with groups of pupils to hopefully inspire them and include them a little bit more in what's happening? So I hope that answers your question. Um,
Steve, sorry, can I just
yes,
say there was another question that came in that I typed an answer to, and it was around what does a good learning walk look like? And I typed the answer, oh, I wonder if that could even be a topic for a future webinar, but in doing so, I dismissed the question. And I just wanted to let you know it was there because I think thinking about what a good learning walk looks like is an interesting question.
yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think you're right, Emma. I think thanks for that. I think we could absolutely create a session all on that. It's not a quick answer, but I think the most important element for me, particularly if we're talking about my idea of an inclusion learning walk, is to sit down again. This will depend on your school's context. So think about your context. Think about what are the things the school is telling you that it does that you might want to look at. And think about also, again, the greatest respect to head teachers, and some of my best friends are head teachers. My wife's a teacher. Head teachers and their staff are doing what they do, and hopefully that's making a tremendous difference. But actually, we can come up with ideas as well. So the what ifs and the what more could we do type questions are incredibly valuable, and actually use a learning walk perhaps to actually inform and to fuel those questions is something I would suggest as well. Thanks for that, Emma. And then the last one on here, I've actually put the website. Have you looked as a governor? And when was the last time you actually looked at your school's website? What does it say about your approach to your approach, I should say, to inclusion? Does it actually reflect you as an inclusive school? And I don't just mean in terms of what it says and links to policies. And do the photographs on the website talk about inclusion? Hopefully, the vision is actually there. What does that say about you as an inclusive school? And that's something to actually think about as governors as well, I would suggest. And of course, what that means in terms of what you'll end up knowing, school context, obviously. If we're aware of context, we can actually ask questions, and hopefully linking back to data, we can focus on the performance of those different groups of pupils. We can analyze, or we can ask the school to analyze the data so that we do know the impact that poor attendance has on certain groups of pupils. Just as an example, we know how the curriculum supports all pupils, and we know how needs are actually being met. And ultimately, of course, it means we know how inclusive our school is. I'm sorry, I missed a full stop off that slide. But again, that's coming back into this culture of no surprises. We don't want surprises. We don't want Ofsted to turn up at our school and say, well, you're not really as inclusive as lots of other schools. Those are things that can easily be fixed, and they are things that should be on our mind. And again, we don't suddenly decide to do inclusion, so to speak, because we know that we're due an Ofsted inspection in a couple of weeks or a couple of months' time. And I can see a question from Mel there. Thanks, Mel. Mel's saying she's thinking about inclusion in the sense of how should we as governors consider it in terms of staff workforce too. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. Um, the infant school where I'm chair, I often visit the school, not least of all because I like to garden and I'm the official school gardener there as well. But I'm often in the school, and one of the things that I'm always aware of when I'm in the school, whatever the reason, is that we have got a very diverse and therefore hopefully inclusive workforce, inclusive as in reflecting our local community, which despite the fact I live in what most people regard as rural Surrey is not something you take for granted. And it is hugely important in terms of the diversity of our school community. And of course, that in itself is a reflection of inclusion. But I think we should, there are a whole host of uh, things that we can monitor, particularly on the HR side, which I guess is what this lends itself to, in terms of the gender split, any gender pay gap that might exist, if we have other protected characteristics in terms of equality represented within our school. How do we ensure that there is no bias intended or otherwise against all of those different groups? But I think you're absolutely right. And of course, even on a very top line level, are we inclusive of the voice of all staff in our school? When we're consulting on making changes, do we actually include all members of that school community in the questions that we're asking, the proposal we're doing, and get feedback from everybody? Because if we don't, say we only go to teaching staff, well, that's not a particularly inclusive approach. And I think there is a lot of scope for us there to think about that. Okay, just aware of the clock ticking by, and excuse me, move on to my third KPI, which is a safeguarding one. And I'm very aware and right of this is a little bit tongue in cheek, so I do apologise. But I think intelligent monitoring is probably going to be in place in an awful lot of your schools here. There might be one or two exceptions, but context, again, context is everything. Knowing the context of the school on a general basis in terms of what our pupils bringing into school as their needs applies equally with regard to safeguarding. Do we actually know what the safeguarding context is? Not on an individual pupil basis, not even on a family basis, but generally speaking, what are the safeguarding concerns that are presenting themselves to our safeguarding teams in our school on a day-to-day basis? Because again, if we know the detail on that, then clearly we are putting ourselves in a position where hopefully we're not going to get any surprises if there is a particular incident. Um, the designated safeguarding lead should always be feeding back to the full governing body. Now, of course, In most of your schools, that's probably going to be, if you're in the primary sector, the head teacher, because in primary, head teachers tend to be, as a generalisation, the designated safeguarding lead. In secondary schools, it probably won't be, but there will be a member of the senior leadership team who is the DSL, and they should be feeding back directly to the governing body or a relevant committee if you have a committee with such a remit. And part of their feedback, I mean, I think my bullet point perhaps isn't as clear here as it should be. When I'm saying on data, data is part of the remit for their feedback, in my view. So to know the number of child protection plans that might be in place in our school, to know the number of child in need plans, um, those who've actually been, subject to early help, all of that is important data for us as governors because it gives us that strategic overview of how safeguarding is actually uh, well, how demanding it is, first of all, in our school situation, but also how the team are working to support those pupils. Part of that support, of course, is to ensure that staff CPD, training development for staff, is actually up to date and relevant to the context. And when I say relevant to the context, if your school is in or around the London area and county lines, for example, is a constant and ongoing threat, then of course we would need to ensure, as part of that CPD, that we are actually arming our staff with the ability to be able to identify some of the telltale signs to say that we've got children who are vulnerable to that. Record keeping accuracy and timeliness, of course, has always been a priority in safeguarding, but this was where Caversham Primary School in Reading, where Ruth Perry was head teacher. This was where her school was actually pulled up. Now, Ofsted may have changed their approach to this a little bit, but it is still a crucial element, and it's something that Ofsted are, of course, mindful of now. But actually, as I say, safeguarding we don't do because Ofsted are coming. We don't do anything because Ofsted are coming. We do it because we want to fervently ensure that children are safe in our schools. So ensuring that record keeping accuracy and timeliness is actually a priority in the school is really important. I would suggest that's a responsibility that rests with the safeguarding governor. If you've got an online system such as CPOMS, it makes it easier because you can do that in an anonymous mode. Otherwise, a great deal of caution needs to be taken because, of course, it would be totally wrong for any governor to actually look at data, look at files which show clearly children's names, family names, etc. So ask the questions, seek the assurance, get it in and make sure it's actually recorded in minutes or in reports from the safeguarding governance school that it is something that we need to be aware of. It can be done in an anonymous fashion, and we should look at ways to actually achieve that. I put safer recruitment here because I've been involved in safeguarding for many, many years, not just as a governor, but I used to be an Ofsted inspector many years ago. I want to say I was a lovely Ofsted inspector, of course. But I do believe that from a safeguarding perspective, which is something that I used to focus on in Ofsted days, safer recruitment is often the poor relative when it comes to the governance of safeguarding. And in order to get that intelligent picture of the overview of safeguarding and its effectiveness in schools, governors must look at safer recruitment. Clearly, if you're a school that or a trust that has a lot of recruitment, it's even more imperative. But for all of us, we should be seeking assurance that every time there's a recruitment, it has been done in compliance with all of the safer recruitment rules, regulations, and statutory requirements. That does include the single central record, and apologies for the abbreviation there, but single central record is crucial, but it is safer recruitment is way, way more than the single central record, and we need to be ensuring that's on our radar as governors. Online safety, of course, takes on ever increasing significance as every year goes by. Ofcom do their annual survey of usage amongst children and young people, and that shows us that out of school, children and young people are spending increasingly more time in an online environment. That has ramifications in schools, not least of all linked to behaviour, of course, but we're coming at this from a wanting to protect children from risk here. Part of that includes our statutory duty as governors relating to filtering and monitoring, of course, and we should be ensuring, as part of our culture of no surprises, what we're actually getting is accurate feedback on, well, what is being filtered in our school. And again, we don't want to know who the person accessing, whether it's a pupil, whether a member of staff, is perfectly sufficient detail. We don't want any names, but how is that being monitored at school leadership level, and what are we being fed back? Because of course that then says, well, if we're filtering and we're monitoring, what remedial action are we taking where remedial action is actually required? Governance training on safeguarding, crucial, and we should be monitoring that, as we should the quality of links with other agencies. And what I'm talking about there, of course, are children's services, the police, and anybody else that we're involved in from a safeguarding perspective. As governors, do we know what the school's response to the question about quality there is? Don't need to apologise for questions, Mel. That's perfectly okay. But she's saying one last question. She doesn't know what's coming next yet. But Mel's saying, do you feel there's a difference in the way we should be intelligently monitoring across trusts compared to maintained schools? Do you feel trustees, especially in larger trusts, should be visiting schools at local level too? I think that's a great question. That comes back to something I was talking about yesterday. And I think, again, KPI monitoring is crucial for trustees sitting on trust boards, particularly where they've got large numbers of schools. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, what they need to do, most of them use some kind of dashboard reporting. Safeguarding doesn't lend itself to dashboard reporting in many ways. So I think some local knowledge is essential. For me, I believe an awful lot of that should be communicated upwards rather than from the trust board down. So if it is possible, if you've got schools within a trust in proximity to each other, then it's fine for face-to-face knowledge is acquired as a good strategy. But if that isn't the case, then I think it actually makes far more sense, because safeguarding happens locally. Whilst you might have the trust board trying to pull the threads together, it happens locally, it's being monitored locally, and therefore I would expect feedback, qualitative as well as quantitative feedback, going up to the trust board from local schools. I hope that answers the question okay, Mel. Okay, so of course what that does for us, it puts, I'm sorry, I clicked twice there, but again, you'll be familiar with my little star shooting in at the end. The no surprises environment is created because we know as governors the environment from a safeguarding perspective in which we're operating as a school. We know what the priorities are relating to safeguarding. We know what we're doing in terms of overall provision to support those vulnerable children, those vulnerable young people in our schools. Again, I do think it's important that we know what external support is accessed by our schools, and we also know about the quality. And the quality, of course, is influenced by how quickly can that actually be accessed. And ultimately, what that provides us with, of course, is a very effective, sorry, this is a very clumsy sentence now. Let's just stick with what I've written on the slide, a strategic overview of the effectiveness of safeguarding. And not all boards, in my experience, actually enjoy that. But I think if you follow those steps that I've outlined, it will put us in a much better position in terms of the information that we've access to. It puts us in a much better position in terms of the questions that we might want to ask. Okay. Last one, and I'm aware we've got 8 minutes to do this, but this will be a little bit quicker, I promise. Financial planning, essential that more governors are financially competent. They're aware of what the school's finances are. They're aware of the state of the health of the school's finances. And in order to do that, I think more governors need to access training on financial competency. We are in the situation where hopefully most of us know what a financial monitoring report, an FMR, looks like. It should be regularly monitored. In academy trusts, the chair of the trust, and if there's a finance committee, have to receive a copy of that on a monthly basis. That's good practice, I would suggest. And if it's good practice, it works equally well in a maintained school. And I think it's really important, particularly if you're a school where you know that there are struggles balancing the budget. You're 3-year forward plan is perhaps not as rosy as you might want it to be. All of those are important considerations, and therefore governors' routine and regular monitoring is absolutely crucial in terms of that no surprises culture. Um, Talking about the 3-year plan, again, making sure that we are regularly reviewing that as part of our ongoing routine. And reviewing it means that where necessary, we're updating it as well. Just because your local authority, just because your trust board, if you have finance delegated, and you might not, just because they say this is an annual process, it doesn't mean to say that we as governors locally don't look at it on a more frequent basis. It's important that, and again, this hopefully will come out of increased governor training on school finances, but it's important that we actually understand the budget process in our schools, including, and probably most importantly, the assumptions that are used to underpin the creation of that budget. Because those are the areas where, as governors, we should be making our voices known. We should be demonstrating challenge there. Um, Jane has put a question on any recommendations for good financial competence training for governors. Um, that's a good question, Jane. Leave that with us. Maybe I'll talk to Emma about that. We have done finance training in the past for governors for schools. It's wrong of me to put myself forward on this, but let's Emma will undoubtedly have picked this up, and it's something that we can come back to you on. But it's not an area that is alien to what governors for schools has actually provided historically. So, oh, sorry, Christine, I can see your question here as well. Are there repeats of this session, as I think it would be good for other girls? That's kind of you to say so. The recording of this is recorded, and it actually goes onto the Governors for Schools website, so you can point anybody in that direction. All they need to do, I think, is register, which is completely free, and then they'll have access to it. Okay. I put numbers on roll here. Arguably, depending on your own particular context, you might be in a school where that ought to be the number one thing that you look at. Numbers on roll and therefore future admissions are absolutely crucial to the funding that schools get, and therefore that is essential knowledge that every single one of us ought to have as a governor. Um, and of course, linked to that, knowing the staffing structure, recognizing that staffing structure is something that governors should be reflecting on a regular basis, and should also be approving on a regular basis. By staffing structure, I mean the overall staffing structure. It's not our responsibility as governors to decide who gets slotted into which role, etc., other than the head teacher and the deputy. But it is important to recognise, certainly in these unstable times when numbers on roll might be falling, what are the impacts for us? Because actually in year 1, year 2 and year 3 of our forward forecast, it may be that if numbers and roll are falling, we have to make some significant cuts in our expenditure. And the most obvious place to go, because it represents such a significant part of our overall expenditure, of course, is the staffing budget. But that takes time, and therefore it's crucial that that needs to be on our radar too. And of course, if we're focusing on all of those different areas in terms of our intelligent monitoring, what we end up knowing is the financial viability of our school or trust. And that's crucial. And what I mean by financial viability is, are we able to operate within the confines of the money that and the funding that we've been given for the current year and moving forward? We'll also know the impact of external factors such as government funding streams, inflation, teachers' pay, etc. All of those are really important to us at the moment because they can have a dramatic impact on the financial viability of the school. We'll also know what remedial actions might be needed, and therefore, if we know what they're needed and we get a heads up on that, hopefully we can ensure that schools are taking mitigating actions along the way. And we're also, again, informing the questions we should be asking. If we're having a more detailed, a more perhaps intelligent look at the finances of our school, hopefully that puts us in a better place to ask those questions, which are all about holding our schools to account. I can see there's a question from Matthew on the panel. Matthew saying, for many trusts, finance is predominantly retained at trust board level. What level of engagement monitoring is suggested here might be appropriate for local committees, local boards? That's a great question, Matthew. I think you're right. And I think generally speaking, finance along with HR is seldom actually delegated through the schema delegation to individual schools within academy trusts. That said, of course, it is still impacted on at local school level by things like the need for supply teachers, by need for resources, etc. I think it will depend entirely on what the scheme of delegation says, but these are things that should be monitored because, again, there are local issues that will impact here. There may be a mechanism in your trust for how they're escalated to trust board level or higher up the operational tree within the trust in terms of their impact. But I believe you're right in terms of understanding the overall context of the school, whether you're in a multi-academy trust or not, does require us to have some knowledge of what's happening budget-wise in our school. So I think, lots of schemes of delegation talk about consulted, informed, etc. If finance is not delegated, it'll be something that I believe should at least local governors should be informed over. Okay, and again, my mouse to work. There we go. What that means is that we end up operating in that no surprises culture. Uh, Implications for governance. Firstly, I think what we need to actually do, and these are sort of linking into what I'm going to say on calls for action in a few moments, reflect on what the school or the trust KPIs actually should be if you've not already done so. I know many of you will have done, but coming back to my Jones Sallis quote, measure what we value, otherwise we end up valuing what we measure. So are we actually looking at, are we measuring, are we monitoring the right things? I think there's also an opportunity to reflect on the current structures that we have within governance in our schools, in our trusts, specifically with, hopefully exploring that question, is it fit for purpose in 2025 moving forward into 2026? Doesn't matter whether you actually end up saying, no, we're not going to make any changes, but the act of reviewing it can sharpen our practices and procedures. And also be aware and stay abreast of those changes that are coming down the road and how they might impact on governance in your school setting. Ofsted is always there in the background to say it shouldn't dictate what we do, but it might actually shape what we do. There's a white paper on education anticipated, and of course, where there's more being said about SEND on an ongoing basis. So all of those are calls for us, I believe, as governors to think about the bigger picture and to get more involved. In terms of immediate calls for action going away from this, I could suggest that if you haven't done it for a while, think about a structure review, even if you don't do anything as a result of it in terms of real changes, so changing committee names, etc., rethinking the terms of reference. Dependent on where you are in your stage of development as a governing body, think about an external review of governance. They can be very helpful in terms of getting governance into an even better if position. Reflect on the emphasis on governance training. There has been a drop off in attendance at governor training, even though the provision of online training hopefully makes it more accessible. But encourage we had a comment on the panel earlier about this would be great to get more governors actually to look at this session. Well, that's lovely to know that, but make it happen. Wave the flag, ring the bell on the importance of governor training, because that does have a very real impact on the effectiveness of governance in our schools. And again, just want to finish by saying, ensure that monitoring is intelligent and it does focus on what really matters to us. That does bring me to the end of what I wanted to say. I know we've had lots of questions. I'm apologising I've gone 2 minutes over. So if there are any questions, by all means, put them in an email and we will actually get back to you. But hopefully we've actually answered quite a lot of those questions as we've gone through this morning. Thank you very much indeed for joining the session. Please come back next time. It will be in the new year now, I think. Enjoy the rest of your day. It's just about light where I am now, but it looks fairly miserable outside, but I hope yours is a good one. Thank you very much indeed, folks. Have a good Christmas and Happy New Year to you. Goodbye.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve. Lots of comments about people really enjoying this session and finding it so helpful. So that's really fantastic. If
That's good
anyone
to
has
hear.
time to complete the survey when I just hit the end button in just a moment, that would be a great time to share your feedback and any other ideas that you've got for sessions. We've had a few of those come through as well. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks, Emma.